Well, we've been going through in this season of Lent, leading up to Easter, looking at different conversations that Jesus has with people in the Gospel of John in particular, because the Gospel of John has more conversation than any other Gospel. And there are some things in there that you won't find in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. And so we've been going through, and chapters 13 through 17 in the Gospel of John include Jesus' final words to his disciples as he's preparing them for the crucifixion that is to come. And where the wheels are rolling, we're going really quickly towards crucifixion. In fact, Judas's plans to betray Jesus are already in place. He just has to execute them, but he's got things ready to go. And so we're really getting close to the end, or a new beginning, however you look at it. And so in this particular story, Jesus is with his disciples at the occasion of the Last Supper. And he's with them when he starts this awkward thing. We're not going to actually go into all the detail, but one thing that we notice is that this is not as much of a conversation as it is an object lesson. We'll just get into the story. It starts off, and you'll see in a moment why this is an awkward situation. Because Jesus, first of all, it declares that he knows where he came from and where he's going. So he knows who he is. He's secure in his identity. But then Jesus takes off his normal clothes and puts a towel around his waist. He's putting on the garment of a servant, of a slave. And this is a slave culture during those times. And so he's dressing like a slave. And this is already really awkward. You have to feel sorry for the disciples sometimes, as they're always trying to catch up with what is going on in Jesus' mind. And in this situation, they have to think, what in the world? What is he doing? And then he gets this bowl, this basin of water, and it is apparent that he's going to wash their feet. And Peter declares what everybody else is thinking. That's usually the case. Peter says what's on his mind. You don't have to wonder what he's thinking. And so he vocalizes what everybody else must be thinking. Really, Jesus? You're going to wash my feet? This isn't right. Think about it. Jesus, they didn't quite understand exactly who Jesus was, but they knew that he was greater than they were. They knew that he was something special. He had already calmed the waves and the storm at sea, and so they knew that he was of God. And so there's no way that they were going to let him do this. Why would he, of all people, the creator of the universe, wash their feet and their toes? It just doesn't make sense. And so Peter says what everybody's probably thinking. He says, you're not going to wash my feet. And he's probably thinking, I ought to be washing your feet, if anything, but not the other way around. And then Jesus says, well, Peter, if you don't let me wash your feet, then you have no part with me. So I don't know what Peter was thinking at that point. Maybe he thought this was a loyalty test, and so he said, well, then don't just wash my feet, but wash all of me. I'm all in other words. I'm dedicated. And Jesus, basically, Peter's missing the point here. And so he says, he just continues on. He lets him wash his feet. And so he washes everybody's feet, and he gets done, and then it's time for the lesson. And Jesus says, do you understand what I've just done for you? You call me teacher or master, and that's right, because I am your teacher. But now that you have seen that I, your teacher, have lowered myself to wash your feet, you are to follow my example, because you are not greater than your teacher. A student is not greater than their teacher, and if their teacher is willing to do this, then you ought to be willing to do it as well. So just as I have washed your feet, you should also wash other people's feet. So for those of you that are in the Christian culture and you're used to these kinds of stories, this might seem normal. For those that maybe you've never heard this before, you might think, what in the world is their fixation on washing feet? And that's because, as I said during the children's time, we don't do that now. We take showers, and so our feet don't get as dirty as they did back then, because we're not walking on dusty trails all the time, barefoot or with open-toed shoes, as they did back then. Back then, people didn't take showers as often. There was no sense of germs or what caused disease or illness, and so there wasn't the need to wash as often. But every few days, every now and then, somebody, they would need their feet washed. And oftentimes it was the slave who would do it. And so back then, washing feet was a very practical way to help others. Nowadays, that wouldn't be the case. In fact, I am pretty certain that if Jesus came today, he would not wash his disciples' feet, because they just wouldn't make sense. It's not a practical need today. He would do something probably that would be very practical today that would also be very awkward and almost embarrassing. I don't know what it would be for sure, but probably something that we would usually leave to somebody that was hired to do it, or something that we would just never imagine a guest doing. I mean, can you imagine having a guest over at your house and they said, "Oh, we'll clean up." It's like, no, it's one thing if it's family, but if it's just like a guest you're having over at your house, you're not going to let them clean up, that's your job. And so Jesus would probably do the same thing, but it would look a lot different. So what do we learn from this story? Well, there's the obvious lesson of following his example, but first I want to talk about the importance of receiving. Because if we're going to follow Jesus' example and be a help to other people and serve other people, then we need to know what it's like to receive that help. We need to know what it's like to have that love for ourselves. And all of us technically have. We've all experienced God at some point in our lives, because we know, just from history, we know before we were even born, Jesus died on the cross for our sins. Does that mean? I guess. We'll see if I can see. We know that we've all experienced the love of God because long ago Jesus died on the cross for our sins. So it's not as though God hasn't done anything for us, but it's just that it's so long ago that it's very theoretical, right? It's very theoretical. It's not something that we experience all the time. But another way that we experience God's love is through acts of people. God oftentimes works through other people doing things, and it can be small things, it can be big things. It could be somebody coming over to clear your driveway. It could be somebody driving you to the hospital when you can't get there on your own. It could be somebody bringing a meal to your house. It could be a number of small one-time things, or it could be something larger. I remember going on a high school Christian retreat where you felt God's love, or you experienced God's love. How? By the way the leadership of the event treated you. They treated you so well that you felt that, and it was explicit that you were supposed to, and this was an illustration of God's love for you. But you don't have to go to a retreat or anything to experience that. Anytime anybody does something for you, especially if you know it's not an obligation, if you know they don't have to do it, but they are taking time, they're sacrificing something of themselves, maybe they're lowering themselves per se, doing something that they don't have to do, but they do it. It shows how much they care about you, and it means a lot. We experience that in times in life, and when we do, we get a sense, we get a hint of the love that God has for us, and it means a lot. But only when we experience it can we really know what it means to serve others and to help others. So that's number one, we need to experience it. But number two is the obvious one. We want to follow Jesus' example, not by washing feet per se, but by helping other people in the ways that they need help. And this means lowering ourselves. Just as Jesus lowered himself and became like a slave, so we lower ourselves to do whatever is necessary to help others. Now, one thing that gets in the way oftentimes is pride, or we get big-headed, and we think we are above certain things, either because of where we are in our career or our status. We think that we are too good, maybe, to do certain things. So maybe you see some trash in the church or outside the church, and you think, oh, well, the janitor will get that. I'm too important. What we don't say that, but what we're saying is I'm too important to pick it up myself. And so lowering ourselves would mean picking up that trash if we see it. Now, that's a small thing. But there are other things you can think of. Are we too good to do anything? Are we too good to help somebody who's in need? Maybe we think, oh, that person needs help, but they really don't expect it, so I'll just go on about my day. That could be tempting to do sometimes. See, there's a good kind of pride and a bad kind of pride. And this kind of pride that lifts us up. We get puffed up and we think we're too important. That's a bad kind of pride. The opposite of that is humility. And if we don't have humility, then that can be something that can be very good to develop in our lives. The Apostle Paul said in his letter to the Philippians, he said, "Do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but instead consider others to be better than yourselves, and have the same mind as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be exploited." And he goes on and he says that Jesus lowered himself even unto death on a cross. It doesn't get much more lower than that. That's about as low as you can get in serving other people. And Jesus showed us the extent of his love by going through death. Now, that's a pretty high standard, isn't it? If we're called to follow Jesus, that's a high standard. Living, serving, helping others, no matter what. No matter what it may cost, no matter what, are we willing to lower ourselves to help others, to not think so highly of ourselves that we think, well, somebody else should do that? It's a good question to ask. And we say, well, Jesus is a pretty high standard, sure. And we're not Jesus, and we're not going to be Jesus, and we're not going to be perfect. But if we're not striving for that standard up there, what are we striving for? Are we striving for something less? And if so, why? Because what is the goal of the Christian life? The goal of the Christian faith is nothing less than to be like Jesus, as best we can. Knowing that we'll make mistakes, and knowing that, we are not going to be perfect. But nonetheless, God doesn't expect perfection. God knows us too well. He knows we won't be perfect and that we'll make mistakes. And we also know that we're figuring it out as we go along, what it means to follow Jesus in the 21st century. But we do our best. That's the main thing, is that you do your best to seek to follow Christ. And when we follow Christ, what that means is he wants us to turn our attention off of ourselves and on to others, and how we can help others, and how we can be a blessing. So I want you to be encouraged that from this story we can take three things. Number one, that it's important to receive help from people. And there will be times in your life when you have to be the receiver rather than the giver. And for some people that's hard. It's hard to receive gifts. It's hard to receive help. But remember how much of a blessing it is when you help others and when you give to others. Well, when you receive help and receive gifts from others, then you are helping them to be a blessing as well. So you're actually helping them, In order for this to work, there have to be givers and receivers. And at different times in life, we're going to be giving, and at other times we're going to be receiving, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so it's good for you to, number one, know that it's good to receive help from others and to experience what it means to be loved, what it means to be cared for. And then number two, take that and follow Jesus' example to be a help and a blessing to others in whatever way they may need. And then number three, develop humility in your life, that we might not ever be blocked from helping others because of our view of ourselves.